Yeah, hello. Good evening, dear students and residents. Happy to see you all after the Eid break. Inshallah, we'll start the class now. I thought I'll just 5 more minutes, but I think we'll start our session now. We'll not delay it any further. So just in continuation with the last class where we had seen some involuntary movements, I would like to present on the other involuntary movements which can masquerade as seizures, known as seizure mimics in children. It's interesting that we have one entire chapter called seizure mimics in children in Nelson textbook of pediatrics. It's an interesting chapter to be aware of because no matter how much ever we get experience, there is a tendency for overdiagnosis uh, of these abnormal movements as epileptic seizures. So the idea of today's presentation is that I would present with an interesting case, a case that I had seen way back in 2016. Just to highlight the importance of knowing those conditions which could mimic seizures. The idea here is that you need to be aware as pediatricians about the wide range of conditions which can mimic epileptic seizures. So the way I would be doing these sessions is that I would try to show one true epileptic seizure followed by those non-epileptic events which can mimic the seizure. So you can be fairly aware that certain non-epileptic events can very closely mimic an epileptic seizures. I would illustrate most of these sessions with videos, and I will give some key points. Okay, so those interested to know more about non-epileptic seizures or seizure-like events could go back to Nelson's textbook of pediatrics, where there's one good chapter regarding your non-epileptic events in children. Right. So this is the idea. So we'll discuss about the non-epileptic events and how they can closely resemble your epileptic events with the help of video sessions today. So the idea here is to know the zebra which is intermingled among your horses. So I'll start with the case now. So this is a 6-year-old boy who had come all the way from Maldives when I was in 2016 in India. This child had the background history of global developmental delay. Right from newborn, he had an eventful newborn period with supposedly having neonatal seizures and birth asphyxia. But he had presented this time with increasing frequency of convulsions, seizures for the last 6 months, increasing vomiting episodes for the last 6 months, and a constipation which was there from very early infancy, a long-standing constipation with failure to thrive. So this is the background. A child is already known to have a global developmental delay, a non-ambulatory child with increasing convulsions, vomiting, and constipation. So when I go back and dig the history, this child was born to non-consanguineous couple. It was the first child. And this child had a birth weight of 2.7 kg. He had cried at birth, but he had a respiratory distress from day 1 of life. And from day 2 of life, supposedly, he had neonatal convulsions, which were repeated episodes of stiffening and posturing, for which he had prolonged ICU stay, prolonged SCABO stay or NICU stay. He was ventilated for a short period and subsequently was started on oxygen and NG tube feeding. So the neonatal course or the SCABO course was eventful. He had put on NG tube feeds. He had supposedly had repeated convulsions which required multiple anti-epileptics, and he was discharged on day 15. And again, after 15 days of life, that is day 15, again he was admitted to the NIC or SCABO with recurrent convulsions, which were more of stiffening or tonic seizures. This child, right from newborn, was managed by different neurologists and different pediatricians all over Maldives and India, and he was labeled as intractable epilepsy with 5 anti-epileptics without any control. So he was on sodium valproate, he was on phenobarbital, he was on clobazam, right? And interestingly, when I had gone through the previous reports, he had normal MRI brain, and so many serial EEG records which were done in the past were normal actually. So this child, when present to the outpatient department, I had a curiosity to understand these events, and I thought I will admit this child for further evaluation, primarily video EEG. So the idea behind admitting this child with an intractable epileptic seizures was to do a video EEG and to document the events and to see myself how difficult the convulsions are. So when I started taking the history after admission with the mother, she told those events were always seen in the awake state, but never at sleep. Okay, so I'm just trying to describe the events. And these were almost around 20 to 30 episodes every day. and each episode could last up to 2 to 5 minutes. And these episodes were increasing for the last 6 months. Initially, those episodes were around 5 to 10 per day, but then started increasing around 20 to 30 episodes per day for the last 6 months. And each episode starts with the stiffening and extension of the trunk, arching backwards with cyanosis of the lips, bluish discoloration. And with that episode, he will be wincing and arching so strongly that you would have difficulty in breathing. And sometimes he used to have desaturation also. Okay, so residents, just think about it, what comes into your mind. And with these episodes, he also had increased salivation and vomiting. So these were the events. But these events were not followed by neck turning or sudden shock-like contractions or sudden twisting postures. And there was no prolonged post-ictal confusion or drowsiness. So this was the history-wise I could get. What I could understand from the history was that there were repeated episodes of tonic arching and stiffening with cyanosis. So interesting history was that more than the seizures, she was more concerned about the diet of the child. She was more concerned about the constipation of the child. She was more concerned about the poor weight gain in the child. So she had emphasis this child is having chronic constipation since infancy. And as you know, like as a neurologist, I thought, okay, I'll get a gastro opinion. Don't worry, let us look into it. The family history was not contributory and the child was immunized up to age. With this, on examination also, there was nothing much significant except that the child had microcephaly or the head circumference, which was slightly on the lower side, with a weight only 7 kgs at 6 years of life. So he had a severe malnutrition, severe protein energy malnutrition, with the weight and the length being less than -3 standard deviation. There was no facial dysmorphism. He had gingival hyperplasia, which I thought was because of chronic phenytoin intake by the child. There was no neurocutaneous markers. Okay, so he had severe marasmus. He had significant wasting and atrophy, just like a marasmus kid. Okay, so examination, he had some brief jerky nystagmus of the eyes. Tone was normal. He had a joint laxity. So nothing was much significant for me to suggest that there is a neurological deficit or any specific syndrome in my mind. Now with this, I had admitted the child and I wanted to go for a video EEG, okay, but luckily I could witness one event myself, okay. So till this point, all my thinking process was, it's probably an intractable epilepsy, right? A child who's having a neonatal admission, probably birth asphyxia, with failure to thrive, with chronic constipation, with recurrent tonic epileptic seizures, with probably GERD, gastroesophageal reflux disease, autonomic dysfunction and vomiting. So in my mind, of course, like all the other neurologists who have seen before, I had thought it's probably the child is having a Lennox-Gastaut syndrome or an intractable epilepsy, okay, or probably an epilepsy because of a brain injury. And still, because of the failure to thrive, I want to rule out certain neurometabolic conditions and neurodegenerative conditions, right? So with these possibilities, one event I could witness during my morning rounds, and that was actually an eye-opener, because the event was so stereotypical. I'll just show you the event. This was, he was shifted for MRI, and after MRI we could do. So the MRI was normal here. And when I did a video EEG, the video EEG was normal, the echo was normal, the ECG was normal, the lactate was normal, the metabolic screening was normal. So I was at the back, back to square one. There is no specific clues. But just look at these events and just think whether anything comes to your mind. So this was the posture the child used to keep. He used to sort of hyperextend his legs, okay? Maybe we'll start from here again. He used to sort of hyperextend at the hip joint. He used to cry, okay? He's crying and he's arching, okay? The mother is sort of holding. It's not such a very clear video. But I'll tell you what happened, okay? This is after he went for an MRI thing, right? Not so clear, but let me explain the event. So with this event, he had this typical posturing of extending the leg backwards, some arching, okay, some amount of vomiting, salivation. But what was interesting was he was sweating profusely. He was sweating profusely and his skin color sort of changed with the event. And much more interestingly, once after the event got over, okay, there was some bit of desaturation. He started smiling and looking at the mom and started sort of interacting, saying ba, ma, etc. Okay. So this is what sort of the discoloration I could see. As you can see here, half of the body here is red in color and the half of the body is pale in color. So putting all things together, okay, during an attack, he has tonic extension of the legs, arching back, increased sweating, this reddish discoloration in half of the body, and half of the body being pale, okay, and more interestingly, smiling after an attack, okay, as if that he is relieved of the attack. At that point of time, I thought it's probably not epileptic seizures. He's having something else, because I've not seen a child with epilepsy who, after an event, would sort of relax and smile and look at the mother and sort of coo and babble. That was interesting, isn't it? So when I started putting all together, a tonic extension of the child with lot of autonomic dysfunction, with a chronic constipation, okay. So when you just go back to the previous slide, see how he has kept his back, okay. It's almost like a significant joint laxity, but there is a position of hip extension here and leg extension here, and he was wincing. Literally, he was actually crying, okay. So much more than a tonic seizure, these events looked like very severe pain attacks. He was almost like crying with arching back and sweating and flushing. It was almost that he had a very severe pain, and at the end of the pain attack, he was like relieved. He started like smiling and relaxing and looking at the mother. So putting all this together, attack which is almost like a pain, with crying, with arching, with tonic extension, with lot of sweating, with red discoloration of half of the body, with vomiting, okay. So when I Googled what it could be, I just put chronic constipation with autonomic dysfunction, okay, and pain. When I just put these three terms in the Google, the first thing that came was something which used to be known as proctalgia fugax in older ages, or extreme pain disorder, okay. So this was the exact story. So he had lifting of the leg upwards, facial grimacing, tonic extension, stiffening of the upper lips, flexion of both the lower lips, reddish discoloration in half of the body, increased sweating, forceful vomiting, and a smile and a relief afterwards. So when I sort of put all the strong, the tonic events with autonomic dysfunction, with pain and chronic constipation, the first thing that came was an extreme pain disorder. So actually what this child had was a severe pain around the anus, okay, around the anus or perirectal area. And because of this severe pain, the child did not pass constipation, did not pass stool, because every time he tries to pass the stool, the pain attack sort of comes, and he sort of holds his stool back, so that, and this is the cycle of having constipation and pain attacks. So this was interesting. So all these years, all these last 6 years, this child was managed as an epilepsy, when actually what he had was pain attacks. So this child is supposed to had a painful crisis. He had reflex tonic stiffening to pain attacks around the perianal area, or a rectal pain. And what he had was a reflex anoxic seizures, or a tonic seizures with a severe perirectal pain. So once I understood this, and we sent a specific genetic testing for a pain channelopathy. It's a sodium channel mutation. The specific target testing came as positive. So this child, all these years, for the last 6 years, had what is known as a sodium channel 9 mutation, or a paroxysmal extreme pain disorder. And all these years, for the last 6 years, he was managed with 5 anti-epileptics, where actually what he required was a good pain management. So the moment I understood this, we had changed the anti-epileptics to gabapentin and lacosamide. His pain attacks reduced significantly. He also was put on oral ketamine, okay. So this interesting case here suggests that we, even experienced neurologists or experienced pediatricians or experienced clinicians, can go wrong when it comes into epileptic seizures. This child was labeled as intractable epilepsy all these years, when actually what he had was paroxysmal extreme pain disorder with tonic arching all the 6 years. So there are only, of course, this is a very rare condition, but you would be surprised when I went back and looked at the textbook of pediatrics, that is Nelson textbook of pediatrics. This particular condition was mentioned in Nelson textbook of pediatrics as a small paragraph of around 8 to 9 lines. So I'm sure all these conditions are there in our textbooks. Only thing is that we are not aware of, and when it comes first time to us, we are sort of taken back and surprised. So the idea of presenting this case is for you residents to understand that whenever we see an epileptic seizure which is not getting controlled, okay, always go back to the history and always go back to the examination, because probably the devil is in the details. There are finer points that probably we are missing. There are finer clues that we are missing, and it could be a non-epileptic attack. So this child had a very good control of pain, and he started regaining in milestones. So that's the second part of the story, right? So misdiagnosis of epilepsy is very, very common, okay, even in bigger centers, okay, bigger tertiary or quaternary care centers. Almost 1/3 of children can be mislabeled as epilepsy when actually they would have is non-epileptic attacks. Okay, so one of our important role as a clinician is that we should avoid overdiagnosis, and also we should avoid underdiagnosis or misdiagnosis, because the moment you label a child as epileptic or epilepsy, the child is going to be on long-term medications, and probably the medications can do more harm than good, right? So these 4 questions is the questions that we ask whenever we see a child with an abnormal event. And the first question of that is that whether it is an epileptic seizure or a non-epileptic seizure. So once you describe the event, always it should be a habit that you ask yourself this question: is this a non-epileptic attack or an epileptic attack? And then you go to the next question, what type of seizure it is, whether it is generalized or focal or myoclonic or absence or atonic and so on, right? So also more interesting is that some of these children can start with non-epileptic attacks and then can have epilepsy as well. And some of the children with true epilepsy can have coexistent non-epileptic attacks as well. So this sort of combination of picture can sometimes be a bit confusing. But let me tell you, this sort of cases or non-epileptic attacks can be challenging to even the senior most consultants anywhere in the world. Okay, so the idea of this chapter is that we as pediatricians should get trained in recognizing these events as much as possible. Okay, right. So how should we approach these abnormal events? Let us quickly go back to the basics of what is an epileptic seizure and what is a non-epileptic seizure. So if I just ask to any of my residents or any of my students, what is a seizure? Okay, the common answer I get is that seizure is a event because of abnormal hypersynchronous neuronal electrical discharges in the brain, which is right. Yes, of course, that is the physiological definition of a seizure. Okay, a seizure. But if I ask, is there any other definition of a seizure? Yes, there is a very simple definition of a seizure. Okay, just be careful of the term that I'm using. I'm using the term seizure. I'm not using the term epileptic seizure. So just plain and simple, if I put, what do you mean by a seizure? Okay, a seizure comes from the English term seize or suddenly capture. Okay, so a seizure, the clinical definition is that a seizure is any sudden attack or any sudden attack which causes functional change in the body or which causes functional alteration in the body. So a seizure is any sudden event which leads on to functional alteration in the body, and this functional alteration could be psychological also, it could be behavioral also, it could be autonomic also, it could be motor, or it could be sensory. So this distinction is very, very important. Seizure does not always means motor jerking or vacant stares or uprolling of eyeballs. It could be even a sensory event. Okay, it could be even a psychological event, it could be even a behavioral event. So this basic understanding of what is a seizure by clinical definition is any sudden event which leads on to a functional alteration, and this functional alteration could be anything. It could be psychological, behavioral, autonomic, sensory, motor. Okay, so once you understand this particular basic definition, then you should divide a seizure into 2 types. A seizure could be an epileptic seizure, or a seizure could be a non-epileptic seizure. So if you have these sudden events, okay, due to hypersynchronous neuronal discharge from your neurons from your gray matter of the brain, okay, the cortical part, the neocortex, okay, then you call it as a epileptic seizure. But if you have these sudden events which causing functional alteration coming from deeper structures of the brain like the subcortical areas, basal ganglia, cerebellum, or brainstem, then you want to call them as non-epileptic seizures or non-epileptic events. It may look like a very simple thing, but believe me, this is a very basic definition which everyone can make mistakes. Okay, so a seizure is an epileptic seizure is one where there is a sudden event because of hypersynchronous neuronal discharge from the cortex, whereas a non-epileptic seizure is a sudden event leading to functional alteration because origin from the subcortical or deeper brain structures. And you know, all of you, that a very basic classification of seizures is into generalized events like generalized seizures and focal events. Okay, and focal events, these are the 2 basic classification. And generalized seizures could be either clonic, meaning by there is a sudden fast to and fro jerks, okay, the 2 component with a fast and a slow component, or there can be a sudden shock-like contractions called as myoclonic seizures, or there can be sudden drop attacks called as atonic seizures, sudden vacant stares, or sudden transient loss of awareness called as absence seizures, etc. So these are the very basic semiology or phenomenology classification of a seizures. A generalized seizures could be either tonic, meaning by sudden stiffening or arching or posturing. Clonic is sudden, fast, rhythmic jerks with a to and fro component. Absence being sudden, vacant stares with a behavioral arrest. Atonic being sudden loss of tone with the drop attacks. And myoclonic being sudden, shock-like contractions. Just like in the last class when I talked about movement disorder, these keywords are very important. Shock-like contractions, drop-like attacks, right? So focal seizures initially used to be classified as a simple partial seizures and complex partial seizures. The preferred term these days is focal aware seizures and focal impaired seizures. So instead of a simple partial seizure, you call it as a focal aware seizure, which means there is a seizure with a retained consciousness or awareness. And complex partial seizures is replaced by the term focal impaired awareness, in which means there is a focal seizure arising from a focal network in the brain like temporal lobe or frontal lobe, in which there is a loss of awareness. It is not the loss of consciousness, it is a loss of awareness. A particular child or a patient is not aware of what is happening to him. Okay, now with this basic framework, what we will try to do is that we will try to fit the non-epileptic attacks into tonic non-epileptic attacks, clonic non-epileptic attacks, absence non-epileptic attacks, atonic non-epileptic attacks, and myoclonic non-epileptic attacks. We'll see to that. So then what are non-epileptic attacks? So non-epileptic attacks, as I told you, are sudden events causing functional alteration which arises from deeper structures like subcortical structures from the brain. There are wide range of events. Okay, so the moment I say non-epileptic events does not always mean they are benign. They can be equally serious like a epileptic seizure. And believe me, some of these non-epileptic events are very, very, very difficult to treat. Okay, especially if you have a child with psychological non-epileptic events. Okay, you have to treat the entire family for the child to be relieved of those particular attacks. Some of these non-epileptic attacks are very transient, okay, and they are age-related non-epileptic attacks. They are also called as transient developmental movement disorders. But some of these non-epileptic attacks can be very much permanent and lifelong as well. Some of them are very stereotypical, very characteristic, and very patterned, repetitive attacks, but some of them are bizarre and keep changing with time to time, okay. So this is basically an idea about non-epileptic attacks. So believe me, this is a wide range or wide heterogeneous range of disorders. There are many disorders which can produce abnormal movements, okay. Whereas if it's epilepsy, it's relatively easy. We know it's of cortical origin. Whereas non-epileptic attacks, personally, I would believe are much more difficult to understand and analyze when compared to that of epileptic events. So how do you try to simplify these non-epileptic attacks? There are three ways that you can do it. The way that you see in your textbook is recognizing the events by age of onset. So there are certain events in a newborn, certain events in an infant, certain events in a toddler, certain events in an adolescent. Of course, this is very, very important. But what we'll be doing in this particular session is that we will try to recognize those events by means of how they look by their semiology. As I told you, what are those clonic non-epileptic events? What are those drop attack non-epileptic events, and so on? And the last, of course, to recognizing the events by means of their etiology, by means of movement disorders, by means of their genetic etiologies, by means of their metabolic etiologies, and so on. Right. So the way that we'll be looking in this particular session is that we would try to classify those non-epileptic attacks by how they look like. So convulsion imitators are those non-epileptic attacks which have a clonic component. Stiffening imitators are those non-epileptic events which have a stiffening or a tonic component. Drop attack imitators are those non-epileptic events which have a loss or fall or unsteadiness. Blank spell imitators are those which have vacant stares and behavioral arrest. And there are certain non-epileptic events which are like very funny, which do not fit into a particular pattern. Usually those are related to unusual eye movements. And you can have non-epileptic attacks happening in sleep, okay? So this is how you tend to classify it. So what we will do is that we will go one by one and we'll try to give differential diagnosis for one by one. Right, so in terms of etiology, the major four etiology which I would be interested is those non-epileptic events which are channelopathies, okay? Channelopathies are brain channels, especially potassium channel, calcium channel, and sodium channel. And channelopathic non-epileptic disorders can be very confusing. These are closely mimicking your epileptic events, right? you can have movement disorders, acute movement disorders, or episodic movement disorders, which can confuse your seizures. Some of these movement disorders are very transient, and hence they are called as transient developmental movement disorders. And some of them are are of later onset, and they are called as paroxysmal movement disorders. Then you have sleep movement disorders, and then you have events with loss of consciousness or vascular related or cardiac related events. Okay, so these are the etiological classification of a seizure mimic. If you want to classify as per the age, right, the events which are common in a newborn are jitteriness, benign neonatal sleep myoclonus. I'm sure most of you would have known at least some of them, but some of you may not be aware of some of them. It may be 50-50 as of now, but in this session, we will try to see as much as videos as possible. So a newborn could have jitteriness, which is, and can have a benign neonatal sleep myoclonus, can have hyperexplexia or a Sandifer syndrome. Infant or a toddler can have breath holding spells, can have what is known as spasmus nutans, shuddering attack, opsoclonus, self-gratification syndrome, paroxysmal upgaze of infancy, and sleep disorders. Older children can have syncope,
it's 8 o'clock,
pseudoseizures, cataplexy, movement disorders, and daydreaming. So this particular etiological framework of a newborn onset, infantile onset, and a childhood onset is very clearly given in Nelson textbook of pediatrics. It helps us to think about differentials in a particular age. Right, and there are two major groups, as I told you, the two major groups at the end of the session, okay, at the end of this class. If at all you want to simplify and to remember it as two major groups, the one major group is what is known as transient developmental movement disorders, and the other major group is pathological movement disorders, okay, and these pathological movement disorders can include channelopathies, vascular things like syncopes, psychogenic events, paroxysmal movement disorders, and sleep events, right? So let's start with the video examples. So we'll go by one. We'll give examples of true epileptic seizures and non-epileptic seizures, right? So what are the convulsion imitators or clonic jerk imitators? So the true seizures would have are your generalized clonic seizures, okay, or a focal seizures which gets generalized. Can you just imagine some non-epileptic events which would have a jerky component or a shivering component or a clonic component? One of the commonest that we can think about is breath holding spells, okay, jitteriness in a newborn, which could have a tremulousness component, right? And you can have commonly a convulsive syncope, a syncope followed by a few jerks, infantile tremor syndrome, and choreoathetosis. So these are the certain non-epileptic events which could have a convulsive component, okay? So here in this video, we see a child having a typical oromotor twitching, okay, is aware, his eyes are open, but still continues to have these oromotor events and few jerks in the left upper limb. Okay, so this is a typical Rolandic epilepsy with the oromotor seizures, salivation happening in sleep, right? This is a true seizure, right? And you can see those oromotor events. So once you see a oromotor seizures, they are true Rolandic seizures. And just have a look at this newborn. The moment I touch this newborn, you can see those low amplitude to high amplitude, to and fro, shivering like movements. Okay, the child, even when the child cries, it increases. There is some degree of tremor like movements in the chin, right? So those who are aware of these movements, these are very easy movements. These are nothing but a jitteriness. A jitteriness can be seen in a normal newborns also, but can be usually seen in an infant of a diabetic mother with hypoglycemia, with hypocalcemia, okay? It can be seen in neurometabolic and seen in conditions with brain injury as well. So if you have a child with a jitteriness without encephalopathy, it's most likely a benign jitter. But if you have a child with a jitteriness and encephalopathy, it's probably more of neurometabolic or asphyxial brain injury or something which is much more complex. So how do you differentiate a jitter from convulsions? So the moment I hold the hands, okay, the jitteriness would stop, okay? It can be restrained, okay? Whereas a true convulsions cannot be restrained, okay? And jitteriness do not have an autonomic component or an ocular component. A true seizures would have an ocular component like eye deviation to one side, whereas a jitter do not have an ocular phenomena like eye deviation or eye gaze. Eyes are usually closed, whereas there is no autonomic phenomena like tachycardia or tachypnea, right, associated with the jitter. So jitter is nothing but a form of a tremor. Usually children outgrow of the jitter by 2 to 3 months. Sometimes it may take about 6 months, okay? But if you have a child who's having significant hypotonia or encephalopathy, this jitter could be part of other complex disorders as well. So the jitter is stimulus sensitive. It could be restrained. There is no ocular phenomena and there is no autonomic phenomena. A very common condition has to be recognized. If you don't recognize, unless unfortunately some of these children get phenobarbital and other anti-epileptics. Okay, there is no EEG correlate for this. This is a very typical infant. Okay, he wanted a chocolate. The mother didn't give a chocolate. He starts crying, and he sort of holds his breath in expiration. Okay, and suddenly the voice doesn't come. There is sort of a spasm in the glottis, and he sort of arches backwards. He sort of arches backwards. Okay, becomes stiff. There is a posturing. Okay, you can see the mother is not scared. She's just keeping the eyes. Okay, there is no cry till this point, and the child sort of collapses. Okay, so yeah, it can be called as a stiffening attack, but some of these children can have a few myoclonic jerks or a clonic jerks as well. Okay, and you can see in this video, after some time, this child would get up. So this automatically means that there is no prolonged postictal phase. You can see here, right? The child is now back to normal, right? And then he again goes back to play, right? So these typical stereotypical attacks, which starts from 6 months to 18 months, okay, preceded by a cry with bluish discoloration, cyanosis, with cessation of breath and a cessation of crying sounds with a sort of a glottic spasm, expiratory apnea, stiffing, arching, followed by a few myoclonic jerks and a quick recovery without postictal state is your typical breath holding spells. This could look very scary because here the child is having stiffening, arching, and a brief loss of consciousness, right? It can be seen up to 4 to 5% of normal children. This is your typical breath holding spells. There are two types, cyanotic type and pallid type. Cyanotic type is aggravated by anger and frustration, whereas your pallid type is aggravated after fear or pain. And the onset is usually between 6 to 18 months, but it peaks between 1 to 2 years of life. Children can have few attacks to many attacks in a day, right? There is some association with the iron deficiency anemia, there is some association with iron deficiency anemia, and most of them disappear by 5 years of age. So giving iron is a good idea. It can reduce the number of attacks. So you need to reassure the parents, because most of these children would outgrow these events, and it is considered as a transient event, and they outgrow these particular events. Now, this was a famous exercise in good students, where what the particular person did was he did a forceful Valsalva maneuver, okay, to young athletes from Germany, from a university in Germany, right? You can see this video again. After this forced Valsalva maneuver, there is sudden loss of tone, and see this type of jerks here. It's a multifocal erratic jerks, okay? A jerks which looks like a shivering goat or a chicken when it is sort of given cut halal, okay? So it's almost like a shivering movements, very erratic jerks. You can see those jerks in the thighs. These are multifocal myoclonic jerks preceded by a loss of consciousness. So again, this condition is very common. There are myoclonic jerks, there are like shivering jerks, but as you can see, there is a typical loss of consciousness preceding that, okay? So if a sudden emotion or a sudden pain or a sudden fear is preceded by this loss of consciousness and then followed by these jerks, then they are typical vasovagal syncopal attacks. But sometimes it can happen without emotional triggers as well. And sometimes you can have cardiac events leading to this loss of consciousness followed by myoclonic jerks. So these are very typical convulsive syncope, usually seen in children from 10 years or 8 to 10 years onwards till they become teenagers. There is no specific reason why some of them have syncope. Some families together, like for example, some fathers and their kids, or some distant cousins and relatives together, can have high tendency to have a syncope. Most of them are vascular events, because there is a sudden reduction of your cerebral blood flow leading to sudden brief hypoxia, causing a degree of discoupling between your brainstem and cortex, leading to a slowing in your brain activity. So this is the physiology, but it's very difficult to explain why these events happens and how they quickly recover as well. So once the cerebral blood flow recovers, the child or the person recovers from the loss of sensation. So it is a typical syncope, and some of the syncope can be associated with brief convulsions, okay? So one of the commonest reason for which EEG is done in most of the countries is because of a syncope followed by few jerks. But if you take a very clear history, as I told you, the devil is in the details. If you get a very typical history of a child who had this event when he was, standing or getting up from sitting posture, okay, or there was a preceding intense stress or fear or anxiety or pain, and there was an event which a loss of consciousness followed by, a bit of a pallor, and cold extremities and sweating, or blackouts in the eyes, followed by this sort of brief jerks and quick recovery of sensorium, you are almost sure that they are syncopal attacks rather than true seizures. Yes, but of course, sometimes it can be very difficult to differentiate between the two. And sometimes, of course, we end up in doing EEG. But as much as possible, if you get a very typical history, do not do a EEG. If you are sure that these events are very brief and very recurring, most likely they are convulsive syncope. And again, most of them would outgrow after a particular age when they have a significant weight gain, right? And you have to encourage them to have a lot of fluids and a lot of salt intake, right? And exercise also helps to come over these attacks. But all children or all young adults with this sort of loss of consciousness should definitely have a ECG and a basic cardiac evaluation, okay? Because if you have an occult cardiac lesion, some of these events can lead to sudden cardiac death as well, okay? So more than an EEG, it is ECG which is very, very important if you especially think about syncope and syncope-related convulsive events. So this we see in India. I'm not sure whether we see this in Oman. Okay, this child belongs to a lower socio-economic status, right? A child predominantly on breast milk with the weaning not started, okay, with the development being normal up to 6 months of age, and then there is this sort of loss of milestones with this sort of generalized tremulousness or rhythmic jerky movements with crying. Okay, so child, there is a sort of regression of milestones as well with extreme irritability or apathy. Okay, there is dark discoloration of the skin, and there is like discoloration of the hair. Okay, there is pigmentation of the knuckles. As you can see, there is some fisting of hands here. Okay, if you examine the mothers, they may also some degree of malnutrition is present. So this is seen in lower socioeconomic status like countries probably in Africa, India and Bangladesh, when the child weaning has not been started and the child is still on breast milk. So what happens is that most of these mothers are vegetarians, vegans, okay, and they are vitamin B12 deficient. So a child who is having breast milk from these mothers also becomes vitamin B12 deficient, and they develop this sort of a generalized tremor with irritability, with mild encephalopathy and loss of milestones. Okay, so this is called as infantile tremor syndrome. Okay, this is called as infantile tremor syndrome, and it's usually noticed after 6 months of age when weaning has not been started. This is, as I told again, this is common in our countries, but I'm not sure it is common here. So one of the best point about this condition is that it's very much treatment responsive. Few injections of vitamin B12 and the child would recover from this tremulousness condition. So the tremors are coarse and the tremors can involve the tongue. So it can produce a characteristic cry known as a goat bleating cry. And you can have a wing beating like a bird-like tremor as well, okay? So this is your infantile tremor syndrome with a tongue tremor, goat beating cry, wing beating tremor, etc. So has a good prognosis after giving vitamin B12. Okay, vitamin deficiency, that is vitamin B12 deficiency in children. So a rare condition, otherwise it's known as infantile tremor syndrome. So this is a girl who had like 3 months of frequent convulsions managed with 3 to 4 antiepileptics. Just carefully observe, I am using a tuning fork, okay, and she's having this bizarre jerks, thrashing movements all over. She's having bit frothing of the mouth, right? And she was managed with 3 antiepileptics without control, and she was referred. As you can see here, I'm using the tuning fork. So what could be the likely possibility here? Right? So what could be the likely possibility here? Thrashing movements, pelvic thrashing movements, eyes are closed, right? Using a tuning fork. So these events, as I've written here, okay, we had a study when I was doing my training program, psychogenic non-epileptic events, okay? So these events are seen in young adults, both boys and girls, okay? And they can mimic any type of non-epileptic events. They can mimic tonic events, clonic events, absence events, atonic events, okay? And surprisingly, more than these clonic jerking movements, it is the atonic events or dialeptic events, also called as dialeptic events, are much more common. There can be some family stressors, there can be some school avoidance, okay? there can be some degree of, hysterical reaction, conversion, and dissociation. Using a tuning fork, why I'm using a tuning fork is that this is called induction technique. Okay, induction is that you tell the child, okay, before that, of course, I will tell the parents that I'm going to do something, okay, and I'll explain to them. I'll send the child out and explain the parents that I'm going to, try to fool the child. I'll say that I'm going to pass current in your brain, like in this video. If I put the audio, you would listen. I'm saying the child that you will now thrash your legs. So once I say this, the child sort of thrashes the legs. It looks interesting, as if you have some supernatural powers and you can make the child do whatever you want. It's almost like hypnosis. You tell, it's called induction techniques. You're telling that you're going to have seizures, the child will have seizures. I told you that you're going to have frothing from the mouth, and the child did frothing from the mouth. Okay, so once you document these events and show the parents, you are pretty sure that these are psychogenic non-epileptic events and not true seizures. Okay, but these are very difficult one to treat, especially if the family is not willing to accept. Okay, they may do doctor shopping and go from one place to another. So one important clue in a psychogenic non-epileptic events is an ictal eye closure. In a true seizure, the eyes are open, the pupils are dilated, right? And as you can see, there is a pelvic thrusting movement, thrashing movements. Okay, this can be seen in true seizures, but it is very notoriously seen in such psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. The falls or sudden collapsing falls is much more common than motor events. Okay, and there are family stressors, and you need a psychologist to be in the picture. Okay, but surprisingly, these non-epileptic seizures can be seen in true epileptic patients as well. So a real epileptic patient who's taking anti-epileptic, a child who's not able to accept the diagnosis or feeling an internal stress can throw these sort of psychogenic events. Sometimes we need a video EEG, long video EEG recording to understand which are true seizures and which are psychogenic non-epileptic seizures. Yes, of course. And in the last session, I showed this video. These are certain movement disorders which can look like convulsions, especially if they come to the emergency, right? In a slightly, if the same child is having irritability or fever coming to the emergency, you may think these sort of thrashing, flowing movements are convulsions. But otherwise, if you remember the last session, I told you these sort of flowing movements, okay, which seems to flow from one part of the another, random, repetitive, okay, unpredictable movements are nothing but choreoathetosis. So this is a typical choreoathetosis in a child with a neurotransmitter disorder, and this can sometimes mimic a clonic jerks. So another type of psychogenic event where this child does this sort of movements while sleeping. As you can see, the parents and the relatives they're not concerned because they know he's sort of malingering these events, thrashing movements. Okay, it's a psychogenic non-epileptic events. Okay, right. So these are in summary some of the clonic events: jitteriness, breath holding spells, okay, and infantile tremor syndrome are some of your clonic events. And if you want to dichotomize into developmental disorders and pathological events, your pathological events are syncope, reflex anoxic seizures, breath holding spells, infantile tremor syndromes. Your transient developmental disorders are jitteriness and breath holding spells. They overcome after a particular age group. Like jitteriness is over by 6 months of age, and breath holding spells stop by around 5 years of age. So it's a good idea to always dichotomize your movement disorders into two major categories: benign developmental disorders and pathological disorders. So what are those stiffening attack imitators? What are those attacks in which there is a arching or stiffening? What are those non-epileptic attacks? So apart from true seizures, what attacks can cause stiffening? I'm just giving some time to think. Okay, right. So those events which can produce stiffening are congenital stiff baby syndrome or hyperekplaxia, self-gratification behavior, status dystonicus, where there can be stiffening and posturing and arching, raised ICT with decorticate and decerebrate posturing, paroxysmal or episodic dystonias with stiffening, paroxysmal torticollis, which is a developmental transient disorder with episodic torticollis, and paroxysmal extreme pain disorder. If you remember, I did explain a case story of paroxysmal extreme disorder that I saw 3 years back. And of course, psychogenic events can also mimic as stiffening attacks. Okay, so we'll see one by one and we'll try to recognize. So this is a child with a sound, okay, has this arching and head drop. So these are like reflex epilepsy, but it's a true epileptic seizure. So once I give a strong sound like this, strong clap, he has this true tonic stiffening. So this is a true tonic seizures. I'll go back again. So once I give a strong clap like this, a reflex tonic epilepsy, okay, it's a true reflex epilepsy with tonic posturing. It's a true epileptic seizure. It's not a non-epileptic attack. A stiffening posture followed, associated with your electrocortical disturbances. Now we'll see some pseudo events. So this is a child with microcephaly who's having this stiffening episodes. Unfortunately, I couldn't show that I'm tapping the forehead or the glabella of the child. So once I tap the glabella or the forehead of the child, this child sort of having this tonic posturing, extension of the legs, as you can see this, and with mild flexion of the neck and mild extension or abduction of the shoulders. So you can see this sort of stiffening attacks with few jerks, few myoclonic jerks. And this attacks of stiffening when you stimulate a child or touch a child or with sound is known as hyperekplexia or congenital stiff baby syndrome or congenital startle syndrome. Okay, or congenital stiff baby syndrome. Now, hyperekplexia is a very nice or a unique symptom, but could be life-threatening as well. Some of these children can have such a severe stiffening that they end up having apneas and cyanosis and sudden cardiac arrest. So some of these are autosomal dominant, meaning by the father or the mother can have some exaggerated startle, and the child can have a severe form of startle called as hyperekplexias, and some of them are very much treatment responsive to clonazepam, whereas some of them are not. Some of them are associated with other neurometabolic and neurogenetic conditions and bad epilepsies or brain injuries as well. So what is important for you to know clinically is that whenever you are seeing a child with a developmental delay or with epilepsy, you need to look for hyperekplexia, and this can be done by a small test called as head retraction test by tapping on the forehead. So once you tap on the forehead, there is a head retraction or a neck retraction. Okay, and as I told you, okay, some of them are autosomal dominant and they are very much treatment responsive, but some of them are very complex, associated with other neurodegenerative or HI or epilepsy conditions. If these children have recurrent apneas or recurrent cyanosis with tonic stiffening, then one of the maneuver that you can teach the parents is called as Vivignano maneuver. You can go Google and read about it. In this maneuver, we ask the parents to flex the trunk. Okay, when there's a severe attack, the parents should like hold at the neck and hold at the knee joint and sort of flex the baby, and that will sort of abort the cyanotic attack. That is called as Vivignano maneuver. This is important, very important to teach the parents, because some of these children can have cyanosis and cardiac arrest as well. So this is a otherwise normal girl of around say 18 months of age, okay, who when alone lies in a bed, okay, and does this sort of a cross scissoring movements of the legs, okay, with sort of scissoring movements and sort of perineal thrust or a pelvic thrust movements. And with these movements, she has this bit of facial flushing, fast breathing, diaphorosis, etc. Okay. So once you go and distract the child, these sort of movements disappear. So these sort of movements are known as self-gratification behavior of infants, seen of course in most commonly in girl infants, but it is seen usually between 8 to 18 months or 8 to 2 years of age, 8 months to 2 years of age, but sort of becomes more covert or disappears when the child grows up. Okay, so this is nothing but a self-gratification behavior or infantile self-gratification behavior seen in infant girls somewhere starting between 3 months to 3 years. They become either more silent or more covert with age, and they can disappear with a distraction or making the child more busy. So it happens most of the time when the child is in boredom or alone, okay, or before sleeping and so on. So the parents needs to be reassured and told to be that this is just a normal childhood behavior and they would disappear with a particular age. So this is considered as a developmental behavioral disorder and it is not considered pathological. So this is a pathological movement disorder. As you see, a child who is intubated and ventilated, presenting with encephalopathy and significant arching. So if this arching is nearly continuous, okay, or very severe, causing laryngospasm, causing breathing difficulty, desaturation, cyanosis, causing tachycardia, or causing hyperthermia, then you think about a severe form of posturing or dystonia known as status dystonicus. So this is a child presenting with status dystonicus and encephalopathy to the intensive care unit. But this is a pathological movement disorder, can be because of encephalitis, can be because of demyelination, or can be because of genetic causes as well. So what is the definition of status dystonicus? It is a nearly continuous hyperkinetic movement. It could be either dystonia or chorea. Usually it is dystonia with twisting, arching, and opistotonic movements, okay, associated with desaturation and respiratory failure and rhabdomyolysis. It is a medical emergency because if you fail to recognize, these children will end up in renal failure because of severe rhabdomyolysis. Laryngospasm can cause sudden cardiac arrest or death. So airway compromise is a significant problem, right? Right. So these children, as I told you, status dystonicus has multiple causes. It could be meningoencephalitis, it could be demyelination syndrome, it could be NMDA receptor encephalitis, it could be conditions like Wilson's disease, it could be primary genetic dystonias, and so and so. But one important message I need to give is that, especially people who are working in emergency and ICU, is that this needs to be recognized and treated and managed, because one way to abort the attack is to put the child on sleep. So a sedation with chloral hydrate or midazolam, when it is started earlier in the attack, can easily abort an attack of status dystonicus. Now, this particular young adult has these very interesting moments the moment she gets up from the chair. You can see the way her leg becomes twisted, okay? It looks that as if she is, fooling around. She's cheating the examiner, and see, she can't walk. Moreover, she is also not able to balance herself, right? And there is some degree of arching, as you saw that she kept her hand over her head just to masquerade, or just to hide the truncal arching that she had. You can see the moment she starts gets up from the chair, she has this twisting postures of her legs. This is a video I took from YouTube. Okay, young adults to teenagers, typical this particular sort of twisting postures or dystonic postures, aggravated. See, she keeps her hands over the head to masquerade her truncal or arching of her back. These episodic movements, which are precipitated by sudden movements like getting up from the chair, or precipitated after alcohol or caffeine or fatigability or stress, are known as episodic movement disorders or paroxysmal movement disorders or paroxysmal dystonias. What you can see here is dystonia, sudden twisting postures. You can have sudden episodic chorias also, sudden episodic balismus also, and sudden episodic myoclonus also. So these are one mixed category of disorders, sometimes can be very difficult to diagnose. They are thought to have feigning, and they are thought to be malingerering, and they are thought to have psychogenic events, but these are true events. These are genetic conditions called paroxysmal movement disorders or paroxysmal dystonias. So paroxysmal dystonias are usually triggered. It can be spontaneous, or it can be triggered after a particular action, like in this case, getting up from the chair. Okay, triggers can include coffee, alcohol, stress, lack of sleep, fatigability. There are multiple types, okay, but the commonest type is PKD1, which only lasts for seconds to minute, but there can be multiple such attacks per day. Even some of them can have up to 50 to 100 attacks per day, and some of them are treatment responsive with carbamazepine or sodium channel blockers. Now this child, so what I showed you was a pathological movement disorder. This child is otherwise normal child, developmentally normal child. He has this monthly 3 to 4 episodes of extreme irritability and tilting of neck to one side, okay, with some diaphoresis and photophobia. See, as you can easily closing the eyes when the father is trying to take the video. So what do you think about these attacks? Okay, these attacks comes monthly 3 to 4, and when they come, they last about hours. They last about 2 to 3 hours, and sometimes 1 to 2 days. So one clue is that there is a strong family history of migraine in the parents. Okay, so these are an attack which usually starts in infancy. So these are known as benign paroxysmal torticollis. You can appreciate the neck tilt towards the right side, okay, with extreme irritability, diaphoresis, some phonophobia, photophobia. Okay, starts usually around 1 year and disappears by 3 years. Each episode can last for minutes to hours and sometimes even days. Sometimes you can have 3 to 4 episodes in a month. Okay, or sometimes you can have only 2 to 3 episodes every 2 to 3 months. It's a form of a migraine variant in an infant. There's a strong family history of migraine, okay, and the treatment is like you're treating a migraine with topiramate and riboflavin and other medications. So if you want to summarize stiffening attacks, some of the benign developmental disorder which can cause stiffening attacks, benign disorders without any developmental delay or without any other issues, is benign paroxysmal torticollis, where there is a family history of migraine, and self-gratification phenomena in infant girls, right? And some of the pathological movement disorders which can present with the stiffening attacks or dystonic attacks are paroxysmal movement disorders like paroxysmal dystonia, dyskinesia, hyperexplexia, and status dystonicus. Let us see the drop attack imitators. So the true drop attacks where a child collapses and falls is nothing but atonic seizures or astatic seizures, where there is like children would just drop about with brief myoclonic jerks. And true atonic seizures are seen in very bad intractable epilepsies like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So what are the non-epileptic events which can mimic a drop attacks? So some of the non-epileptic attacks which can mimic a drop attack, of course, you can have a psychogenic non-epileptic attack in which the child keeps on falling again and again. but the attacks which can mimic a drop or sudden loss of consciousness is a syncopal attack. By far the commonest is a syncope, which can be confused with atonic seizures. We can have an interesting phenomenon called as cataplexy in children having sleep disorder called narcolepsy or excessive daytime sleepiness. A cataplexic attack is a sudden drops seen in children with narcolepsy or excessive daytime sleepiness. It's a rare phenomena, but I have seen around 4 children over the last 4 to 5 years. You can have episodic ataxia with lot of loss of balance, incoordination, and frequent falls. You can have episodic vertigo with falls, and you can have psychogenic attacks. Okay, so I'll try to show some of the video. These are the true drop attacks or atonic seizures, where there's a sudden rapid loss of tone. Okay, like in this child, in the end, you have the sudden falls seen in children with the Lennox-Gastaut syndrome. So these are true atonic seizures. Now let us look at this particular child. So this is a child who is having excessive daytime sleepiness. Okay, she is having narcolepsy. What is excessive daytime sleepiness? The moment they get up, they go into sleep in the morning hours. See how she having this sort of loss of tone. You can see how the way she sort of not able to balance herself and she sort of falls. It's a very, very interesting video, okay, from YouTube. Even though I have seen one child, the child I saw did not have such a severe falling attack. She falls down, but there is no loss of consciousness. As you can see, somebody is trying to talk to the child, right? If I just pass the video, after some time, she would just get up. And all around them, people around them are actually laughing in this video. So she's not able to maintain her tone, right? And as you can see, she looks very hypotonic. She looks a bit having a droopy eyelids, right? And when the people around them laugh and smile, again she has this sort of collapsing falls. Okay, she's not able to balance herself, right? She's like collapsing. As you can see, there is some droopiness and falls in the neck first, and then in the trunk and falls. This is very, very interesting. It's called as cataplexy. So what is cataplexy? Cataplexies are episode of sudden muscle weakness precipitated by intense emotion, mostly laughter. Okay, laughter or laughing or smiling, all around them are laughing. So she's not able to maintain her tone. It is seen in children having sleep disorder called as narcolepsy. Very interestingly, these child can initially present only with facial droop or slurring of speech. These are called as partial cataplexic attacks. So if you're able to identify partial cataplexic attack, just a droopy face, just a dull looking face, apathetic face are called as partial cataplexies, to severe collapsing falls. Very difficult to treat otherwise. 50% of children with narcolepsy can have these cataplexic attacks, and they're associated with extreme daytime sleepiness. So the treatment is treating with stimulants. Okay, it's a rare phenomena, but it is important to be aware of an attack called as cataplexy. Similar, still more, some more rare conditions. This child has these episodes of unsteadiness, as you can see here, right? Even in this video, I'll try to show this child. Okay, this episodes of unsteadiness lasting for minutes to hours. You can see this child again bit dull and drowsy, sometimes associated with twitching around the muscles and twitching around the eyes. And after sometimes the child completely recovers. So these sort of episodic attacks with unsteadiness, okay, with recovers episodic unsteadiness leading to falls, not able to balance himself, but very much responsive to acetazolamide, is a channelopathy in the brain related to calcium channels or potassium channels known as episodic ataxias. Okay, so you need to remember these children would be mislabeled as having atonic epilepsy or myoclonic epilepsy because they are very apathetic during the attacks. This is a episodic ataxia. So episodic attacks are sudden brief attacks to seconds to minutes. Some episodic ataxias can last for hours to days also. Sometimes you can see this interesting phenomena of muscle twitching in the face and the hands, okay? And some of them are very much responsive to acetazolamide. These are episodic ataxias. Onset is in bigger children, somewhere around 5 to 8 years, can be associated with some speech issues and some nystagmus and some autonomic dysfunction, okay? So this is a child where again, as I showed you, it's an induction technique. This particular doctor is using a key to say that you are going to fall down. You're going to have a loss of consciousness. I'm going to send electricity into your brain. Okay. I'm going to pass current into your brain. So just see how the doctor is doing the induction technique. Okay. This is called induction. Induction means suggestibility. I'm just telling the child that you will fall. So just by telling the child that you are going to fall, you're going to have loss of consciousness. This child again was on 3 or 4 antiepileptics for supposed generalized epilepsy, but her EEGs were normal, right? You can see after some specific time, she just falls off. Okay. And as you can see in the last video where I showed a psychogenic event, here also you can see an eye closure. See the way she keeps her hands in an unusual posture, bizarre posture. Okay. So this is a very interesting psychogenic non-epileptic attack, but predominantly there is a dialeptic or falls, psychogenic falls, okay, or hysterical falls. It's important to recognize thing. One important thing that easy thing that you can do in the outpatient department is used to use induction techniques with a tuning fork or suggestibility. You suggest that you will have the attack and they will have the attack. Okay. You will be surprised by yourself that you can do these simple methods and induce an attack, right? And she's now having negative emotions like crying. So crying and screaming is also sometimes seen, or talking during the attacks is also sometimes noted during psychogenic attacks. So these are psychogenic non-epileptic attacks. So some of the summary are pathological attacks are of variable etiology. As I told you, you can have cataplexy, right? There are no transient attacks. You can have syncope. Syncope is the most common cause of drop attacks, right? And episodic ataxias as well as narcolepsy. So if you have child with blank spells, vacant stares, you can think about true focal epilepsy or atypical absence epilepsy or a typical absence epilepsy. And if you think about non-epileptic attacks, which can mimic an absence epilepsy, it is a child with autism or ADHD having blank spells. So if you see children with ADHD or autism, they can have this blank staring episodes into the sky called as daydreaming spells. And some children with psychogenic episodes or self-gratification episodes can have vacant stares. So one easy way where you can trigger a true absence seizure is by giving a piece of paper and asking him to blow. This is called as hyperventilation. I routinely do it in the OPD. It's a very easy technique. See, there's a paper here. The moment they keep on blowing a piece of paper, you can see the child is now having a true absence seizure. This is a true absence seizure, okay? Very easy technique to induce a true absence seizure. So if you are gonna refer to pediatric neurology for absence seizure, before referring, you can use this induction technique of using a piece of paper and blowing hyperventilation to trigger an absence attack. So this child is having a true childhood absence epilepsy. But this child, who's an autistic child speaking with the speech therapist, and a child with ADHD or autism, is having this blank staring episodes as if she is like thinking. I'm sure most of us have, okay, you, me, everyone can have these sort of staring spells where we dream into the space and think about something. So these are called as mind wandering attacks, mind wandering spells or daydreaming spells, right? And most of us, including me, would require some form of therapy to get out of such inattention spells. I'm sure most of us would have these attacks. So these are known as mind-wandering spells or daydreaming spells, can be seen in children with autism or ADHD. So what are some funny movement attacks? So the funny movements do not fit into a particular category. Some of the funny movements which are true epileptic seizures are spasms called myoclonic spasms or epileptic spasms, and non-epileptic attacks which could look very funny or which do not fit into a particular pattern are benign sleep myoclonic attacks, tics, stereotypies and mannerisms, sometimes even choreathetosis, and some funny eye movements like spasmus nutans and paroxysmal tonic upgaze. So this is a child with true infantile spasm. Sorry, the media is not running, but I'm sure all of us know what is a true infantile spasm or salam attacks, where there are sudden flexor spasms associated with cry, irritability, and encephalopathy. Whereas this is a child, newborn, having this sort of rhythmic to arrhythmic myoclonic jerks involving the upper limbs more than the lower limbs, very erratic jerks, always in sleep, okay, always in sleep. And once a child gets up from the sleep, these attacks stop. These are not associated with any autonomic phenomena. There is no tachycardia, okay, there is no behavioral changes. And these sort of erratic jerks which you can see in a newborn is called as benign sleep myoclonus. They usually have a frequency of 1 to 5 hertz. But if the child is having encephalopathy with these sort of myoclonic movements, then you should think about neurometabolic or neurodegenerative conditions, right? So benign sleep myoclonus is again a frequent condition. It causes a lot of anxiety to parents. They think this is quite unusual and they come to the emergency, right? But if you are able to understand this, always the events happens in sleep, right? In an otherwise normal child, these are benign sleep myoclonus, requires no treatment. In fact, anti-epileptics like phenobarbital can worsen a benign sleep myoclonus. It disappears on arousal and it never happens on the face, and it disappears by 2 to 3 months. Okay, so this is your benign sleep myoclonus. So this is another interesting funny attack. Just observe the child. So she will do like this sort of movements. Okay, let me again go back. So they will do this sort of movements where there is as if somebody's put ice onto a back. If somebody puts ice water onto your back, you will do this sort of shivering movements where there is a stiffening and there is some flexion at the neck and the sort of teeth clenching and shivering like movements. Again, this can cause a lot of anxiety among parents. This is a very, very, very common, at least common. I have seen many children having this sort of movements. This is called shuddering attacks. So shuddering attacks of infancy start somewhere between 8 to 18 months. Some of them can have up to 20 to 100 episodes per day. Interestingly, this episodes was first mentioned when children were fed, Chinese fried rice and Chinese noodles. Okay, hence it was actually called as Ajinomoto syndrome. So some children do not like this Chinese food or Chinese fried rice and do sort of shivering movements. Okay, so these are shuddering attacks. This is a form of a tremor basically, and they disappear by around 2 to 3 years. And it's a very benign developmental disorder. Okay, and no treatment is required. But though some of the children can develop essential tremor when they grow up, no specific treatment is required. It's almost like ice water is put onto your back. It's a shivering like tremor movements called a shuddering attack. And some of these funny attacks can be complex stereotypies. In my stereotypies class, last class, I would have told about this repetitive patterned movement, involving your head and face, like this repetitive writhing movements or repetitive trapping movements. Okay, so these repetitive movements without loss of awareness or loss of consciousness are not seizures. And this child also I would have shown in the last session. We can always confuse this sort of sudden uprolling of eyeballs as absence epilepsy, but if you can carefully see, the child is fully conscious. But at the end, you notice here now it will happen. Yeah, she has this sort of sudden uprolling or upgaze. Okay, and it sort of bothers her, but most of the time she's normal, right? You can see here again. So this is called as paroxysmal tonic upgaze of infancy. You can have around 20 to 30 episodes per day, but it can take some long time, usually seen in children between 3 to 9 months or 3 months to 1 year of age. This is tonic deviation upside with slow saccades, no loss of consciousness. EEG is absolutely normal. It can disappear, but some of the children can have mild ataxia. It is considered as a benign developmental disorder without any obvious etiology or obvious pathology. And again, this video I showed in the last class, a child, otherwise normal child developmentally, can have this sudden rapid horizontal nystagmus with neck tilt. See, as you can see here, I'll show you sudden rapid horizontal nystagmus here with the neck tilt and head tremor. Okay, and comes and goes multiple attacks per day, and with a normal fundus, normal eye examination, and this is called as spasmus nutans of infancy, sudden onset rapid horizontal nystagmus with head tilt and tremor. Disappears by 2 to 3 years of age. Okay, again, no treatment is required. It's considered as a benign developmental disorder of infancy. So some of the pathological movements are tics, stereotypies, and mannerisms, but most of these disorders are very benign and they disappear with age. So some of these sleep attacks which happens only in sleep are true epileptic seizures. So the true epileptic seizures which happens in sleep are frontal lobe epilepsy, Rolandic epilepsy, and occipital epilepsy. I repeat again because I teach my residents who are posted in neurology. The true epileptic seizures which happen in sleep are Rolandic epilepsy, occipital epilepsy of childhood, and frontal lobe epilepsy. But certain non-epileptic events can happen in sleep are night terrors and sleep myoclonus and rhythmic sleep disorders. So here you can see a child with a true frontal lobe epilepsy. He would have a posturing of the hands known as figure of 4 posturing. He is in deep sleep, but he sort of, let's wait for this. There is a turning of the neck. There's adversion of the neck, and you can see a posturing of the hands. This is called a figure of 4 posturing, stiffening. Okay, this is called as and some sort of automatism. This is your frontal lobe epilepsy which happens at night. So this sort of posturing, dystonic posturing, is seen in a frontal lobe epilepsy. So if you ask a history of nighttime epileptic seizures with a dystonic posturing, it's a clue towards frontal lobe epilepsy. But see here, this is a child who sleeps at night, gets up and suddenly starts screaming. Okay, and suddenly starts screaming, sits up, looks at one side, extreme fear, extreme screaming, looking towards one side, shouting, calling the mother, but has no memory of the events. Okay, and again goes back into deep sleep. Usually seen in the first 3 hours of sleep in the non-REM phase or the NRM phase. The child is confused and incoherent with retrograde amnesia. The next day you ask about the events, they forget the events. They do not remember the events. Okay, it can start usually in children between 4 to 12 years. Usually the age of onset is around 6 to 7 years of age. These are called as night terrors. Okay, it's a sleep parasomnia. Okay, it's a wide age range, but usually we see in children between 6 to 7 years of age, and they remit by late adolescence. This is nothing but a sleep parasomnia called as night terrors. Of course, you need a video EEG, but sometimes you need a polysomnography to identify the classical stereotypical events. Okay, extreme fear, extreme anxiety, some autonomic manifestation, but not associated with any epileptiform discharges. This is interesting. Even after coming here, I mean, the last 1 year, I mean, some of them had discussed with me in terms of videos of this child showing this rotating head movements before going on to sleep. Okay, or whenever the child get bored, they do this sort of rotating head movements like this, before they go on to sleep. Okay, and it can happen like few episodes, 2 to 3 episodes in sleep itself. These are called as rhythmic movement disorders of sleep. The interesting term for this is called as tactatio capitis nocturna, or head rolling movements in sleep, or rhythmic movement disorders in sleep. They are considered as a sleep disorder. They can last for minutes to hours, but usually there is no treatment. It can be in the form of head rolling or arm banging, arm rocking, or roving movements. It can be present in certain families as well. It's again considered benign. Okay, and these movements are usually of 0.5 to, by definition, polysomnographic definition, 0.5 to 2.5 hertz. There should be more than 4 events, usually seen after 3 months of age, but resolves in late childhood. It can persist for many years. Okay, and but usually does not require any treatment. It's called as rhythmic movement disorders of sleep. So the benign disorders are rhythmic sleep disorders, but certain parasomnias like sleep terror is pathological and requires some sort of medical management. So just to summarize, I have shown you convulsion imitators, tonic stiffening imitators, drop attack imitators, absence imitators, funny movement imitators, and sleep attack imitators. I have showed you the videos that I had with my own patients, okay, like convulsive syncope, status dystonicus, hyperexplasia, paroxysmal torticollis, episodic ataxias, paroxysmal movement disorders, etc. So as a resident, if I wish for something, I wish that you should be aware of the benign developmental movement disorders like spasmus nutans, like paroxysmal tonic upcase, like this rolling head baby, like shuddering attack. Please try to understand the benign developmental movement disorders, okay? And you should be confident in diagnosing these benign developmental movement disorders. So how to identify them? So as I said, history, and history, okay? So the devil lies in the details. Again, I tell you, you should take history like a police dog. This was told by my teacher while I was doing my medical student. He always says the history is the first step. If you're able to do like a police officer and take all fine details in the history, you are most likely to end up in a good diagnosis. So if you are doubt, take multiple videos. These days it's very easy, okay, as the parents to take multiple videos. Where there is a doubt, you can go for a prolonged video EEG recording. So because those events which are associated with cortical electrographic abnormalities are epileptic seizures, and those that are not are non-epileptic events, right? And this sort of flowchart I have given you. So the first step for you to identify is the nature. Even in the last class I told you, please focus on the nature. How does it look like? Twisting, flowing movements, jerky movements, okay? Identify the phenomenology and fit into like events, convulsive events, stiffening event, drop attack events, okay? And then think about differential diagnosis. Once you have done that, you can think whether it's a developmental movement disorder or whether it's a pathological movement disorder. And each point of time, think about the age of the onset. What is the age of the onset? Newborn, okay, it could be benign sleep myoclonus, it could be jitteriness, or it could be a hyperexplasia, okay? Infant, it could be a breath holding spell, and so on. Always think about these particular key questions to reach a diagnosis. So, and always remember, there are a developmental movement disorder and there are pathological movement disorder. The two important pathological movement disorder which are of interest to the neurologist are paroxysmal movement disorders and channelopathies. Okay, I'm sure Dr. Nabil and Dr. Salim, we all have a lot of these episodic ataxias and a lot of paroxysmal movement disorders which present to us in OPD, right? These are interesting, and it is important to be aware of such pathological movement disorders like paroxysmal dyskinesias and channelopathies like episodic ataxia. So the take-home message is that the diagnosis is mainly clinical. You need a good history and you need a good video recording of events. Some of these events are easy to treat, but some of them are difficult to treat. Okay, awareness is very, very important of your transient developmental movement disorder. Okay, should never, as a pediatrician, should never miss these simple transient developmental movement disorder. When in doubt, always go for a video EEG and expert opinion. Okay, so that you can avoid a misdiagnosis. Thank you for the patience listening. I think today we were able to finish in 1 hour. I'm sure, I'm looking for more audience. I think from next week onwards, I'll have mostly on Tuesdays. But if you feel that if you don't need weekly sessions, we can have sessions every 15 days as well. So, if you can message me or you can WhatsApp me or even you can put in the chat whether we need weekly sessions or sessions every 15 days. What do you think about it? And Or what do you think about it? Whether you should have weekly sessions or you should have sessions every 15 days? And is there any questions? I'm open for questions. So what do you think? We should have a consensus, some consensus here. Should I have a weekly sessions or sessions every 15 days? You can inform Dr. Nora. Yeah. You can probably inform Dr. Noora how we can go about it, because if I can have weekly, I'll think I'll be able to cover major part of neurology, pediatric neurology in around 3 to 4 months. My idea is to finish major neurological topics in 3 to 4 months, so that most of the residents, when they get posted in neurology, it will be easy for me to discuss, you know. Probably I can ask them to go back and see my videos in YouTube, and get back to me so we can discuss, you know. So that's the idea. Right. So inshallah, we'll have every Tuesday sessions if there are any questions. Okay, so the idea here is to know the transient developmental disorders and certain pathological movement disorders, and think about how they look like seizures, and think about the differential diagnosis. Right, so that's one question. Can a paroxysmal sleep myoclonus seen in a 9-month-old infant who's developmentally normal? Okay, so benign sleep myoclonus starts in a newborn and usually disappears by 3 months. At the most maximum 9 months. Okay, we call it as a benign sleep myoclonus, but there is also other condition called as sleep myoclonus of infancy or sleep myoclonus of childhood, which can start at variable ages. They are just brief jerks. They are not like more persisting rhythmic or arrhythmic jerks, which I showed in the video. And all of us, including you and me, all of us will have some degree of myoclonus, especially when there is a transition of the sleep. When we are going in from drowsy phase to the non-REM phase or stage 1 sleep, all of us have some degree of brief jerks called as hypnagogic myoclonus, that is going into the sleep and having a brief jerks, you know, sudden jerks of the body. They are called as hypnagogic myoclonus, which are essentially normal. One of them asked, how can you differentiate paroxysmal dystonia or gaze palsy from tics? Tics are very repetitive, okay, predictable to unpredictable, sudden movements which can be stopped, okay. There is an urge and suppression. So whenever you think about tics, just ask the child to try to stop the events for a period of time. If you're able to suppress the events, okay, then it's most likely tics. Okay, dystonia cannot be suppressed. In fact, when the child becomes more anxious, the dystonia actually increases. So a dystonia increases with anxiety, whereas tics can be suppressed if the child wants to suppress. And in tics, there is an urge to do the repetitive movements, right? Okay. Right, so inshallah, we'll have these sessions every Tuesday. I hope I have answered the questions. So from next week onwards, we can have some approaches, like approaches to ataxia, approaches to hemiparesis, approaches to stroke, approach to epilepsy, and approach to, or you can suggest the topics to Dr. Noora. Please suggest the topics to Dr. Noora, and we can follow the topics. If there is an interesting case in between, I would like to discuss that interesting case in these weekly sessions. So if that is over, thanks all for your patience listening. Inshallah, we'll see next Tuesday. Thank you very much.